August 21st, 1911. The Louvre was a tomb of marble and shadow at 7 in the morning. Vincenzo Perugia stood in the salon car, his back pressed against the cold stone wall. He remained motionless, a shadow among shadows, blending into the rhythm of the early maintenance crew. His breathing was shallow, timed to the fading echoes of footsteps on the parquet floors. He watched the final guard turn the corner, the sound of heavy boots receding into the distance, until the gallery fell into a vacuum of silence. Only the soft hum of the city outside penetrated the thick walls. Perugia shifted his weight, his palms damp against his sides. He checked the hallway once more, confirming the vacancy. The air felt thin, charged with the weight of centuries of art. He took a single, deliberate step toward the wall. His gaze locked onto the frame. The room was empty. The witnesses were gone. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the wood, and stopped. The moment had finally arrived. He gripped the sides of the frame. It was heavier than he expected, the wood biting into his palms. He lifted, the wire catch scraping against the wall, with a sound like a serrated blade. He froze. A janitor's bucket clattered somewhere down the long, vaulted corridor. Perugia held his breath, his eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for a shadow to cross the threshold. When only silence returned, he exhaled and pulled harder. The frame cleared the mounting hooks with a soft thud. He held the masterpiece against his chest, the weight of it pulling at his balance. He turned, moving toward the service stairwell with short, measured strides. The floorboards groaned once under his weight, a sharp crack that echoed through the empty gallery. He didn't look back. He ducked into the shadows of the stairwell, the cold concrete stairs damp beneath his boots. He placed the painting down on the landing, his hands trembling as he checked the hallway above. He was alone with the face that had watched the world for 400 years. The frame was a cage. Perugia worked the edges with his fingernails, prying the wood until the canvas finally came loose. He peeled it away, the oil paint cooled to the touch. He discarded the heavy frame in the corner, folding the canvas into a tight roll. He wrapped the roll in his smock, securing the bundle under his arm like a common parcel. He descended the stairs, his pulse drumming against his ribs. At the service exit, he pulled the iron ring. It did not budge. The door was locked. He pressed his shoulder against the wood, but the frame held firm. Panic flared. He drew a small screwdriver from his pocket, his hands shaking as he attacked the mounting screws of the handle. Metal scraped against metal. He twisted, forced the mechanism, and the bolt slid back with a sharp final click. He pushed the door open. Morning light flooded the narrow alleyway. He stepped out onto the cobblestones, the cool air of Paris hitting his face. He did not look back. He walked into the city, the weight of the canvas secure against his side. The room in Paris was small, smelling of damp plaster and coal dust. Perugia pushed the heavy wooden trunk into the corner, out of the reach of any stray light. Inside, the canvas rested face up, its surface undisturbed by the passage of time. He lived there for 2 years, a ghost in a city that had moved on from the sensation of the theft. Every morning, he locked the door, knelt by the trunk, and lifted the lid. He verified the edges, touched the corner of the dry wood, and closed it again. The silence of the room became his only companion. He stopped seeing himself as a thief. He began to draft letters in his mind, composing arguments for the return of the treasure to its home. He paced the floorboards until they creaked under his weight, rehearsing his justification. He was not a criminal. He was a restorer of history. He was the man who would finally correct a centuries-old imbalance. The city outside continued its routine, oblivious to the masterpiece hidden beneath his bed. He waited, his conviction hardening like the oil paint itself, convinced that his moment of patriotic glory was drawing near. The trunk was modified. He had installed a false bottom, a narrow compartment designed to shield the canvas from view. He packed his belongings on top, pressing down firmly to ensure nothing rattled. The train ride to the border felt like an eternity. He kept his hand on the handle of the trunk, his knuckles turning white as the carriage slowed at the frontier. An official boarded, moving slowly down the aisle, tapping on luggage with a wooden cane. Perugia held his breath. When the man reached his seat, he demanded the trunk be opened. Perugia complied, watching as the official sifted through shirts and heavy books. The man paused, his hand hovering inches above the hidden compartment. Perugia leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs, ready to lunge if the seal was broken. The official grunted, slammed the lid shut, and walked away. Perugia exhaled, the sound lost in the grinding of the train wheels. Hours later, the landscape shifted to the familiar hills of Italy. He checked into a quiet, sun-baked hotel in Florence. He sat on the edge of the bed, pulled a list of names from his pocket, and found the address for Alfredo Geri. He dialed the number, his voice steady, finally ready to offer the masterpiece to the home it had been denied for centuries. The hotel room was dim, illuminated only by a single lamp flickering near the window. Alfredo Geri stood by the door, his posture stiff, his eyes darting toward the heavy trunk resting in the center of the floor. Perugia knelt before it. He gripped the edges of the false bottom, but the wood had warped in the humidity. He grunted, digging his fingernails into the seam, pulling with everything he had. The wood groaned, then gave way with a sharp crack that echoed against the bare walls. Geri took a half-step back, his hand hovering over his chest. Perugia reached inside, his fingers trembling as he pulled out a rolled canvas. He set it on the bed, smoothing the edges with slow, deliberate palms. The face stared back at them, the impossible, faded smile, the dark landscape behind the eyes. Geri did not speak. He stopped breathing. He stepped forward, his shadow falling over the canvas, and leaned down so low his nose nearly brushed the surface. The silence in the room became absolute. Geri reached out, his fingertips hovering inches above the portrait, but he did not dare touch it. He looked up at Perugia, his face pale, lips parted in a silent, disbelieving gasp. The world's most famous face had returned from the dead. Geri moved to the back of the canvas. He pulled a small magnifying lens from his pocket, his hand shaking as he traced the edges of the frame. He found it. The wax seal of the Louvre, pressed firmly into the wood. He exhaled a long, ragged breath, the sound of a man witnessing a ghost. He looked at Perugia, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and professional greed. "This must be verified at the Uffizi," Geri whispered, his voice barely audible. Perugia tightened his grip on the edge of the bed. He had carried this burden across borders, kept it hidden in the dark, and now he was expected to hand it over to a stranger. He looked at the painting, then at the door. If he refused, the deal would die. If he agreed, he lost control of his prize. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky movement. Geri wrapped the canvas in brown paper, tucking it under his arm like a fragile bird. He turned and walked out. His footsteps hurried on the floorboards. Perugia remained in the center of the room. He sat on the floor where the trunk had been. The space felt empty, hollowed out. He checked his pocket watch. He waited, his ears straining for the sound of movement in the hall, convinced that he had just secured his place in history. Perugia paced the narrow floorboards, his footsteps rhythmic and steady. He stopped to look into the small, cracked mirror above the washstand. He straightened his posture, smoothing his hair, convinced that by nightfall, the headlines would celebrate his return of the treasure to its rightful home. He imagined the crowds in Florence, the speeches, the recognition of his singular devotion. He was not a thief. He was a restorer of national pride. The silence of the room was absolute, heavy with his own anticipation. Then the door shuddered. A blow struck the wood, heavy and metallic. Another followed, harder, splintering the frame near the lock. Perugia did not jump. He did not reach for a weapon or look for an escape. He stood perfectly still, his chin lifted, his expression one of calm, detached acceptance. The doorframe groaned and gave way. Two men in dark uniforms pushed into the room, their faces flushed, hands reaching for their belts. Perugia exhaled, a slow, quiet sound of relief. He raised his arms, turning his wrists toward the officers. He did not offer a word of defense. As the metal restraints clicked shut around his joints, he felt only a cold, sharp satisfaction. The world finally knew what he had done. The courtroom in Florence was stifling, crowded with spectators who leaned forward to catch a glimpse of the man who had brought the world to a standstill. Perugia stood in the dock, his shoulders squared. When he spoke, his voice remained steady, echoing against the stone walls. "I did this for Italy," he declared, his eyes scanning the gallery. He spoke of historical injustice, and the right of a nation to reclaim its soul. The judge looked down from the high bench, his expression unreadable behind thick spectacles. Outside, the news had already turned. The newspapers no longer painted him as a common criminal, they called him a patriot. The tension in the room broke as the verdict was read. 7 months. A sentence so light it felt like an endorsement. A murmur rippled through the benches, a low hum of approval that grew into a visible wave of support. Perugia did not shrink under the weight of the gavel. He looked at the faces around him, seeing not condemnation, but a strange, growing admiration. He had stolen a masterpiece, and in doing so, he had captured the imagination of a nation. As the guards led him away, he walked with his head held high, fully convinced he had achieved his goal. The painting returned to the Louvre, but it did not return to the same world. The frame was placed back onto the wall, now protected by a thick, transparent shield that kept the public at a permanent distance. The empty space that had once haunted the gallery was replaced by a constant, shifting wall of humanity. People lined up for blocks, winding through the stone corridors just to catch a glimpse of the smile that had been missing for 2 years. The theft had stripped away the painting's obscurity. It was no longer just a portrait. It was a survivor. Every day, thousands of eyes fixed upon the canvas, searching for the secrets that had driven a man to commit his crime. The air in the room grew heavy with the collective breath of the crowd. They moved in slow, rhythmic pulses, pressing forward and then retreating, caught in the gravity of the image. The glass reflected the flickering lights of the gallery, shimmering over the surface of the work. Behind the barrier, the figure remained motionless, immune to the gaze of the world, finally elevated to the status of a global icon. The mystery had become the spectacle, and the smile remained, untouched and unreachable, watching the centuries pass from behind its wall of light.